It felt like all the built-up tension was desperate for some kind of resolution, some answer. Without even thinking, I let my hand brush against his, a quiet signal that it was okay to keep going. He paused for a second, like he got the message, and then moved even closer. The warmth from his body seemed to wrap around me, and my heart started pounding in a way I'd never felt before. You know, looking back, it's wild how something so small could feel so huge. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Robert, I said, my voice sounding almost foreign to me. After that, words didn't matter anymore. The silence was filled with gestures, touches, and this weird, unspoken rhythm between us. That night changed everything for me. And here's where things get complicated. Let me explain. It all started when my dad, by accident, walked into the wrong room and climbed into bed next to me, thinking I was my mom. What began as a bizarre mix-up took a turn I never could have predicted. To give you some context, let me introduce myself. My name's Mara. I'm 22, and yeah, I still live with my parents, Robert, who's 52, and Emily, 49. Our house is nothing fancy, but it's predictable. My parents have this traditional marriage where weekends are sacred. They'd sit together, crack open a bottle, and just talk about everything and nothing. It was their thing. But that night, nothing was normal. Not even close. In my house, weekends always followed the same script. My dad and mom would be on the couch, glasses in hand, laughing about the dumbest stuff. It was their ritual after a long week of work. By Saturday night, it was like nothing else mattered as long as they had their drinks and their jokes. I used to think it was kind of funny, in a predictable way. I'd watch from the sidelines, chuckle a little, and then go back to my phone or laptop. Over time, though, I started paying more attention to their behavior. I think it was because I noticed how much my dad changed after a few drinks. He wasn't a daily drinker, but when he did, he'd get chatty, way more than usual. My mom thought it was cute. Me? I just found it interesting. It was like he became a different person for a few hours. And then there was that one Saturday. The one where everything shifted. They were in the living room like always, but my dad was louder, more animated than usual. He was telling stories about his bachelor days, and my mom was just laughing along. I was in the kitchen, making a snack, but I couldn't help overhearing. He'd say things like, "Oh, I was the man back then, Emily. You only won me over because you knew how to drive me crazy." I was cracking up by myself because, honestly, my dad's jokes were equal parts hilarious and embarrassing. After that, I went to my room and locked the door. I had this weird feeling, like something was about to happen. I can't explain it, but it was there. Maybe it was because my dad was louder than usual, or maybe it was because, for the first time, I really paid attention to how he acted when he drank. Either way, I couldn't shake the thought. I tried distracting myself with videos on my phone, but my mind kept circling back to my parents. Had they always been this open with each other? Had they always had these wild conversations when I was little? It felt like I was seeing a side of them I'd never noticed before, especially my dad. I always thought of him as this serious, methodical guy, but with a drink in his hand, he was almost someone else. And that's when things got weird. Before I went to sleep, I heard my mom say she was heading to bed. My dad, of course, stayed in the living room, glued to the TV in his bottle. I turned off the light, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about how these little moments can show you sides of people you never really see. It was just a random thought at the time, but it ended up meaning a lot more later. Because that night, it wasn't just another Saturday. I didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. My parents were in the living room, laughing and drinking like they always did on weekends. It was their thing, sitting on the couch, reminiscing, and talking about the past. It was like a ritual, their way of unwinding after a long week. But this time, my dad seemed more relaxed than usual. He'd had a bit too much to drink, and his voice carried through the house. My mom, who usually kept up with him, decided to call it a night early. She smiled, said goodnight, and went upstairs, leaving my dad alone in the living room. I was lying in bed, wide awake. The window was open, and I could hear my dad's laughter mixing with the sound of the TV. I was scrolling through my phone, half distracted, half wondering how much he was enjoying himself, just completely lost in the moment. As the night went on, the house got quieter. The only sound was his heavy footsteps in the hallway. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, I got this feeling, like something was about to go down. I don't know if it was intuition or just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was strong. Suddenly, my bedroom door creaked open. That was weird because no one ever comes into my room without knocking. When I looked up, it was my dad. He had this dazed look on his face, like he was trying to figure out where he was. For a second, I thought about saying something, but I didn't. He stepped inside and said, his voice shaky, "Emily, I'm here." Yeah. He thought he was in my mom's room. My heart started racing. My first instinct was to tell him he was in the wrong place, but something stopped me. I stayed quiet, just watching as he clumsily sat down on the edge of my bed. He had no idea. He just lay down next to me and let out a sigh, like he was ready to pass out. I froze, trying to process what was happening. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. And at the same time, this strange curiosity took over. Part of me wanted to see how far this would go. And that's when things really took a turn. He settled into the bed, completely unaware that he wasn't next to my mom. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning. What was supposed to be just another Saturday night turned into something I never could have imagined. I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening, but then this strange idea started creeping into my mind. What if I didn't say anything? What if I let him believe he was with my mom, just for fun? I didn't plan to take it too far, I just wanted to see how he'd react. I know it sounds crazy, but in that moment, it felt like the situation was daring me to play along, like it was some kind of game with no clear ending. So instead of setting him straight, I decided to join in. "Robert," I said, mimicking my mom's soft, gentle tone. He turned to me, his eyes barely open, squinting in the dark. I had to hold back a laugh. He really thought I was her. "Emily?" he asked, his voice slow and heavy, like he was half asleep. "It's me, love," I replied, doing my best to sound convincing. He let out this long, relieved sigh, like all the weight of the world had just fallen off his shoulders. And there I was, sitting there, weirdly enjoying the whole thing. It was almost funny how clueless he was, completely unaware that anything was off. At one point, he reached for my hand, but I subtly pulled away, trying not to laugh. He mumbled something about how exhausting his day had been and how he just wanted to rest. I couldn't believe I was doing this, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. It was like I was caught in some kind of twisted experiment. I decided to keep the act going. "You worked hard today, didn't you? You deserve a break," I said, still pretending to be my mom. He smiled faintly, his eyes still closed, and let out a quiet murmur of agreement. It was strange, but I couldn't help feeling a weird sense of satisfaction watching him relax like that. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but there was something oddly fascinating about it, like I was in control of this bizarre little scene. We stayed like that for a few minutes. He'd say something incoherent, and I'd respond as if I were my mom, like we were in some kind of improvised play where my only job was to keep up the charade. The feeling of being in charge, of steering the situation, was almost addictive. I knew I wasn't going to take it too far. It was just a game, something to pass the time and explore this weird dynamic. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't the most interesting thing that had ever happened in that house. And then, things got even more intense. "Are you tired today, love?" I asked, softening my voice even more, trying to sound as sweet and gentle as possible. He turned his head toward me, his eyes still barely open, and let out a low laugh. "A little," he said, "but with you here, I relax." That caught me off guard. For a moment, it felt like he was fully into the game, even though he had no idea he was playing. I couldn't help but smile. I decided to push it a little further. "You deserve this more than you know, don't you?" I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I let my hand trail down his arm, just a light touch, but enough for him to feel it. His body relaxed even more, like that small gesture had somehow eased his tension. "You work so hard," I continued, my words wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "But I don't think you ever really take a moment to breathe, to just be." He let out this deep sigh, like he was finally letting go of all the stress he'd been carrying. "Yeah," he murmured, "you're right. It was almost too easy." He was so vulnerable, so open, and I was the one pulling the strings. I shifted slightly, moving a little closer to him, just enough to make the moment feel more intimate without crossing any lines. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. I could feel the tension building, but I was still in control, or at least, that's what I told myself. "You've been so tense lately," I said, my voice dripping with sweetness. "I think it's time you started taking better care of yourself. You need to relax more, with me. I think we both could use it." I let the words hang in the air, watching as they seemed to sink into him. He smiled faintly, just a small twitch of his lips, but it was enough to shift the mood in the room. The atmosphere felt thicker now, like the air itself was holding its breath. I knew this was risky. I knew I was playing with fire, but the thrill of it was too much to resist. "Emily," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in his gaze, something he wanted to say, but the words seemed stuck. I could see the conflict in his expression. He wanted to open up, to say something, but he held back. "What's on your mind, love?" I asked, leaning in just a little, my tone playful but still warm. "You can talk to me, you know. I'm here. Always." I kept my voice light, but I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, something raw and real just beneath the surface. He shook his head and chuckled softly, the sound almost nervous, almost embarrassed. I felt my cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from the intensity of the moment. I was in control, but at the same time, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand. I stayed right where I was, watching him, knowing that the longer this went on, the more power I had in this strange little game. There was something thrilling about seeing how far he'd let himself go, how much he'd allow himself to show. As unusual as it felt, there was a strange satisfaction in watching him navigate this unspoken dance, and I couldn't help but revel in it. I let my fingers trail softly over the sheets, moving them in slow, deliberate motions, like I was drawing invisible patterns in the air. It wasn't just a habit, it was a way to add a little intrigue to the moment, to see if he'd respond. And he did. His hand reached out toward mine, like he wanted to take it, but at the last second, he hesitated. His hand hung there, suspended in the air, like a question he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. "It's okay, Robert," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry. I'll take care of you." And just like that, the game continued. I was in the driver's seat, steering this delicate dance, and he was following my lead without even realizing it. But as the moment stretched on, something shifted inside me. The tension between us sparked something I hadn't expected, a flicker of heat, something deeper and more intense than I'd intended. My heart started racing, the steady thrum of it echoing in my chest. Every movement, every touch, felt heavier now, like the world around us had taken on a new significance. His hand brushed against my arm, then my shoulder, the touch light but undeniably charged. It was like the air between us had thickened, filled with a new energy that was impossible to ignore. I didn't pull away. Instead, my breath quickened, and I could feel something shift inside me, a tension, a heat, an undeniable awareness of him. "Emily," he murmured, his voice low and rough, carrying a tone that seemed to vibrate through the space between us, almost too quiet to hear. "You look so different today." In that instant, I knew what I should do. I should stop, step back, regain control before things went too far. It was the logical choice, the safe choice, but for reasons I couldn't explain, something inside me broke free. It was like all the built-up tension between us had finally demanded an answer. Without thinking, my hand moved on its own, reaching toward his with a subtle yet deliberate motion. It was a quiet gesture, a simple touch, but one that carried all the weight of my unspoken permission. It was an acknowledgement that whatever was happening in this moment was okay, that we could keep going, keep dancing this strange dance we'd started, without needing words. He paused, just for a second, like the weight of what wasn't being said had reached him on some deep, almost primal level. There was something in his expression, a quiet understanding, as if the air itself had carried a message only he could grasp. Then, without hesitation, he closed the distance between us, stepping even closer. The warmth of his body radiated toward me, and for a moment, I felt like I was enveloped by his presence. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was something deeper, a connection that coursed through the space between us, making my heart pound in a way that felt both foreign and intoxicating. It was like every beat of my heart was in sync with a rhythm that didn't belong to me alone but to both of us, suspended in that one fleeting moment. "Robert," I whispered, my voice barely recognizable, strained with the rawness of the emotions surging to the surface. It wasn't just his name I uttered, it was an acknowledgement of something much more profound, a quiet surrender to everything unfolding between us. After that, there were no more words. The air thickened with the weight of silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than anything you could say. All that remained were the movements, slow, deliberate gestures, touches that seemed to communicate a language beyond words. Our bodies, as if guided by some unseen force, moved in perfect harmony, responding to each other with a fluidity that felt almost effortless, like we'd always known how to fit together. In those moments, it was like everything else in the world had fallen away. Time itself seemed to stand still. The rest of existence was forgotten in the wake of what was happening between us. It felt like we were outside the reach of reality, in a world where nothing mattered but this one instant, this shared breath. And yet, even in that stillness, I knew with a deep, undeniable certainty that everything was about to change forever. But in that moment, with the weight of his body so close to mine, all I could focus on was the warmth, the heat of his skin against mine, the closeness that pressed us together in a way that felt both comforting and overwhelming. Deep down, I knew we'd crossed a line, a boundary that, once passed, couldn't be undone. And though a part of me knew there was no going back, I couldn't bring myself to think about the future or the consequences. All that mattered, for those precious minutes, was the feeling of being bound to him in a way that transcended everything else. When everything finally settled, the rush of emotions slowly subsiding, I lay there beside him, feeling the quiet rhythm of his breathing next to me. The steady rise and fall of his chest became the soundtrack to my thoughts, which were in complete disarray, swirling with emotions I couldn't quite name. My mind was a jumble of questions, of realizations I wasn't ready to face. But above all, I was painfully aware that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air, like a promise, or maybe a curse. And all I could do was let the gravity of the moment settle in. Thank you for watching until the end. If you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to hit that button, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much.